Hey guys, welcome to the very first Vinyl Frontier podcast. This is a place where you can come to share and expand on your music interests. So that happens when you tune in every week and we give you a new music challenge that results in song submissions from you and other music members that all gets compiled into a themed Spotify playlist at the end of the week. So since this is our first episode ever, I'd like to just take a moment to explain how we got here. But if you're a Vinyl Frontier member and you're just looking for the rundown on this week's music challenge, I totally get it. Feel free to jump ahead. I've got timestamps detailed in the video description below. That said, I'm Josie Lavender and I love music. I'm not your usual Vinyl Frontier host, but I am one of the original members. It actually started with my dad about 4 years ago, and I'm one of the original members because it was just a casual family tradition. It started when me and my sister were visiting my dad's a lot. We had been moved out of his house already, but we were visiting for dinner or for use of a laundry machine or someone to calm us down from a quarter-life crisis. You name it, we were just there frequently. And my dad decided to take advantage of that by forming a deeper bond through music. He wanted to share his own music interests and the artists that got him through difficult times and learn a little bit about us and our music interests, how we had come to discover the artists that were meaningful to us, and we learned a lot about each other through that process. He did this by just insisting that me and my sister almost pay a cover charge with music. We had to give him our top 3 favorite songs at the time for every visit, and then he'd plug that into Spotify, which would spit out a suggested playlist for us, and we'd just talk about the music that we were listening to, and we'd talk about it a lot more intentfully than before, which led to some really interesting conversations. So we shared that with coworkers and friends, who in turn shared it with their friends and the friends of their friends, and now we have an official music club with several hundred members across 4 different continents. So obviously with that many people, we had to take things virtually, and the song submission process isn't quite as casual as just swapping songs over dinner. It's a little bit more structured, but we've managed to keep it pretty personable and community-oriented. And one of the ways that I think we're able to do that is by giving everyone the opportunity to blurb about their songs when you send them in. So you don't have to, but if you want to, you can give us a little write-up about why you chose the songs you did, or maybe share a memory that kind of enhances the listening experience for you. All of that gets published at the end of the week with the Spotify list. And since we started doing this, we have over 200 themes in the can. So there's a lot of themes out there, and because it's been so popular, we have not missed a music week since starting. So we decided to also offer this podcast as just a way for you to tune into some of the conversations that we would have had at the beginning of it all. It also provides an opportunity to share the music playlist with others and just keep growing that community. If you know someone that you think would like to play along, or just want to give them the rundown on how it all works, you can do that by simply hitting the share button below, and we'll take care of the rest for you. But that's the end of my spiel. Now we're moving on to this week's theme, which is artists under the influence. And I'm not talking about artists using drugs or alcohol. I'm talking about artists influencing other artists. So your challenge, should you choose to accept it, is to link together 3 to 5 different songs from 3 to 5 different artists, where the first artist created music that influenced that of the second, and so on down the line. But as we look at influencers, we're going to have to answer the question, or at least look at the question, of what influencing really is and how that's different from just straight up music thievery. Or in other words, what's the difference between veneration and appropriation? Which are big questions. I don't think I can answer them in just one episode, or ever really. I don't think I could really offer a definitive answer to that. But I do think it's worth asking the question and reflecting on it, so that's going to be a big theme in today's discussion. It's also going to be a continued theme throughout the entire podcast series. Now, obviously I'm asking you guys to do a lot more research and reflection than we have in weeks prior, but I don't want that to intimidate you or stop you from playing along. I figured it would be helpful if I just shared some of my research with you. just to jumpstart your song selection process or maybe inspire you to start with your own research. I did come across some really interesting artist connections that jumped around genres and went down much less traveled pathways, but I really did just want to focus on the song selection process this week. So I figured the best way to do that was to talk about artists that we all know and love. Maybe you aren't as familiar with them, and that's okay too. Discovering new music can be fun, but it's entirely possible that you're familiar with the songs we'll talk about or some of the history. Again, feel free to jump around. I'm also going to be linking a Spotify playlist throughout this whole podcast, so that can be another great resource to kind of jumpstart the song selection process for you. Either way, we're starting by linking together B.B. King with Elvis Presley. So getting started with B.B. King, he was born as Riley King in 1925, and he grew up as a choir boy in the Mississippi Delta. So he attended the Elkhorn Baptist Church, which had a pastor named Archie Fair. And Archie would perform his sermons. He used a Sears Roebuck Silverton guitar, hope I'm saying that right, and that really captivated the young Riley. So Archie would teach him guitar chords along with extra Bible lessons, and it's really Archie Fair who's our first influencer in this chain of artists. He ignited that love affair between B.B. King and the guitar that later made him so famous. Having a gospel background is pretty common amongst musicians, and it was especially common at that period in time. But something else that was becoming more and more popular was the blues, which started long before that, but the blues was really gaining traction in mainstream media at this point in time. And specifically subgenres of the blues like Delta blues, which was hugely influential for Riley King, that was really becoming more distinguished, so people could tell that apart from Chicago blues or honky-tonk. And when Riley wasn't exploring gospel music, he was exploring artists like Blind Lemon Jefferson and Lonnie Johnson. And if those names don't sound familiar to you, that's understandable. We don't really talk about them today, but I think that we should, because they were fundamental in the uprising of the blues, and consequently they really shaped a lot of modern genres. So house and techno and dance, electronic music, that whole scene is deeply influenced by blues music, which I think is kind of cool. At first glance, those genres have a very different sound and feel to them, but if you have time to do the research, they do pull a lot from blues music, and you can start to kind of hear the similarities between the two, even though you have to dig a little deeper for them. So if that's something that interests you, that could be a great launching point for your song selections this week. As promised, I've linked that Spotify playlist up above. The first two artists on there are going to be artists that influenced Riley King, and then the third track takes a larger genre jump. It's a house song by Frankie Knuckles, and this particular song pulls a lot from funk music of the 1970s. But if you have time to do research on it, the funk songs that Frankie Knuckles pulls from are deeply connected to the blues that Riley King would have played and been informed by. So that one's kind of a cool song, and there's a lot of that in-house music, especially a lot of those mashups with Frankie Knuckles. Definitely a cool opportunity to dive into that a little deeper with this playlist. I'm going to stop nerding out about house music now, though, and jump forward in time a little bit to 1941. This is when King Biscuit Time began airing on the radio, and that's actually still airing today. It's the longest running daily broadcast in American history, which I think is kind of cool. They play a lot of Delta blues, which again was hugely impactful for Riley King. That's actually the radio show that inspired him to apply as a disc jockey and a singer at WDIA. It was based out of Memphis on Beale Street. And that's actually where Riley King got the name Beale Street BB, BB standing for Blues Boy. So that's how we got B.B. King. Now, when B.B. King began recording, he produced a lot of his music through a man named Sam Phillips. And Sam Phillips would later go on to found Sun Records, which in turn became kind of the bedrock for Elvis Presley. Now, before we dive into Presley's rock and roll career, I just want to point out that B.B. King intentionally distanced himself from rock and roll. And it wasn't because he didn't see that that was the next up and coming thing, it's just that he found himself in a really difficult position. So B.B. King, along with a lot of other blues artists at the time, like John Lee Hooker and Muddy Waters, I'll link them in the playlist as well, they all found themselves in this state of being more influential than they were successful. They were watching other artists embrace their sound and their style, and these other artists were making lots of money from it, but they weren't. So even though B.B. King had earned the title King of the Blues, he just was not reaching the same level of success as his contemporaries, which is a hard pill to swallow. So it's understandable why B.B. King was not so quick to embrace the rock and roll scene, which was predominantly white. And there are some exceptions to that. He actually did take a lot of influence from Little Richard and Fats Domino. Those are more artists that I think we should talk about more frequently. I will link them in the playlist as well. I'm curious to see if you can hear their influence on B.B. King's music. But despite the fact that B.B. King wasn't exactly jumping on this trend, it didn't stop people from falling in love with his style, with his influence. If you want a reminder of just how captivating his music was, I've got him linked in the Spotify list as well. Moving on from the King of the Blues to a man simply known as The King, Elvis Presley was an ardent listener of B.B. King's radio show, and he would often try to sneak into nightclubs to see B.B. King perform. I say sneak because Elvis Presley was not allowed into these shows. It was still the early 1950s, and segregation was still very much a thing. So Elvis Presley would find ways to sneak into these shows, and that's actually how he met Ike Turner, who's one of many people that helped bolster or jumpstart B.B. King's career. So he was in a lot of the same circles and around a lot of the same performers as B.B. King. And Ike talks about positioning instrumentation kind of awkwardly on stage just to help sneak Presley in. So, he'd set a grand piano up in a way that kind of blocked Elvis from the audience. And that way Elvis could sit there and observe these up-and-coming black artists. Which makes me wonder what he would have been without that opportunity. Because everything that Elvis saw and listened to on those stages very much influenced the artist that he was going to become. Which brings us to the question, was Elvis's observation just a harmless way of learning, or did he choose to appropriate from the artists he was sneaking in to see? Now, musicians influence other musicians, there's no doubt about that, and sometimes the most casual exposure to another artist's work can kind of leave a watermark on the observer. And most of the time I think that influence is harmless and innocent, but when it starts manifesting in the form of a song or a lyric or a melody, it usually leads to litigation. So imitation may be the biggest form of flattery, but not in the music business. Or at least cut them in on 50% of the profits if you're making money from it. Which Elvis did not, despite very much being influenced by these black contemporaries. So now we're back at square one wondering, is that appropriation? And that's a difficult word to throw at Elvis because it implies that he knowingly and willingly took advantage of black artists, all just to booster his career and make oodles of money without giving much care or consideration to the backs that he was literally climbing over in his way to success. There's a lot of documentaries and podcasts out there addressing this issue, and opinions are very split on the matter. So this is one of those places where I'm going to let you come to your own conclusion, but I do think it's important to take a look at what other artists have to say about his rise to fame. So if we ask Ike Turner, he's someone of the belief that Elvis absolutely stole from black artists. In fact, Ike Turner believed that Elvis's dance moves were stolen directly from Ike himself. And that's a big claim if you stop to think about it, because dancing was so much a part of Elvis's brand. Even if you can't name a single Elvis Presley song, you probably can think of his iconic hip movement and the way that he moved. So there's a big accusation from Ike Turner. He also believed that Elvis took major liberties from an artist named Pinetop Perkins. I've linked him in the Spotify list as well to see if you can hear a similarity between the two sounds. Someone with a differing opinion on Elvis is a man named Paul David Hewson. You might know him as Bono from U2. And Bono's a big activist. He's also a vehement defender of Elvis Presley. So not only does he believe that Elvis's music was not appropriation, he believes that Elvis's music propelled the civil rights movement, which is a pretty big claim. And I'm not sure I'm willing to agree just yet, but essentially Bono believed that while he could see where Elvis was taking from Black culture and Black artists, he thought that by incorporating that into his sound and his style, Elvis was kind of giving a platform to Black culture where it would have never otherwise reached white audiences. So again, I'm not sure that I agree, but someone with a similar take on Elvis, maybe less bold, is a man named Rob Thomas from Matchbox 20. He uses the term fog of innocence when describing Elvis. And basically he's saying that, yeah, Elvis took a little too much from Black artists, but he did it without meaning to cause any harm. He just got lost in the passion of the incredible music that he was influenced by, which kind of feels like we're giving Elvis a free pass. Keep in mind, these opinions are coming from white dudes, and they're basically saying that whether Elvis was causing harm or was not, his heart was in the right place, and he was not aware of how problematic his actions could have been. Now, on the flip side of that, we have Sam Phillips, who's another white dude, and as we mentioned before, he produced music from both Elvis and B.B. King. Now, Sam Phillips, when talking about his search for Elvis Presley, said that he was looking for a white man with the Black sound and the Black feel. Now, that quote is censored because the original quote is disgusting, but there's a very gross, open admission to appropriation. And it's coming from the man who brought fame and fortune to Elvis. So I completely acknowledge that a producer's objective and mentality is very different from an artist's, but I have a really hard time believing that Elvis wasn't at least a little bit aware of his privilege and what that was taking away from other Black creators at that time. Someone else with an interesting take on Elvis's rise to fame is Tony Bennett, and Tony compares Elvis to a human Coke bottle, which I really like because I think that Elvis was very much a product. Everything about his brand was meticulously manufactured. And there are artists that create, and then there are artists that are given work to record or represent or embody. And you have to place Elvis squarely in the second camp. I think that's important because while there's nothing inherently wrong about that, Elvis wasn't writing his own hits, and that's okay, but he wasn't reinventing them either. So had he put his own spin on this music, I think the imitation would have been a little less obvious, and we might be having a different conversation. But instead, artist was taking this influence, not giving credit to the original creators, and he wasn't really reinventing the wheel. The only thing different about Elvis using this style was the audience. It was a white audience who now had permission to openly show appreciation for the sound. And don't get me wrong, there are lots of artists out there, especially from the 1950s, who were just flat out racist or much more open about their appropriation. Pat Boone is one. If you've never heard Pat Boone's Long Tall Sally or Tutti Frutti, congratulations, because he completely sucked the life out of those songs. And it actually annoyed Little Richard, who originally recorded both songs. So keep in mind, this is at the time of race records. When Little Richard first recorded Tutti Frutti, it was not marketed to white audiences. Pat Boone came along, decided to re-record the song as a white man and make money off of white audiences. And he didn't owe any royalties to Little Richard, despite the fact that it was his song. And it was much more popular, despite him completely butchering it. White audiences loved the song, because they were only listening to Pat Boone's version. So it came in much higher on the top hits at the time and remained much higher than Little Richard's version. And that annoyed him so much that he decided to write Long Tall Sally, knowing that Pat Boone would steal that song from him. He wrote it with lyrics and in a style that he knew Pat Boone couldn't pull off. And it totally worked. Little Richard's song was much more successful. It was higher on the charts and lasted higher on the charts for longer than Pat Boone's version. So that's another fun starting point for song selections if you're interested in that. So at least Elvis wasn't that. He wasn't a Pat Boone. He did bring talent and flair to his performances, and no matter where you land on the Elvis debate, he absolutely influenced other artists, and a lot of other artists. In fact, the Beatles are one that really credit him for inspiring and sparking the career that they built. We're running out of time for this episode, but I will close out the playlist with a song from the Beatles, and I'm curious to see if you can hear any of the influence from the other artists we've talked about in that Beatles song. If you've made it this far in the podcast, thank you for listening. I really hope that you play this week. I hope that you discover new artists or maybe just a surprising connection that you didn't expect. All of that implies music growth, which is what this playlist and this music club is all about. So again, thank you for listening. Please play along and please tune in next week for a new music challenge. Thanks, guys.